Hello, everybody. This is the Nairobi Ideas Podcast, a podcast that gives a public platform to the Africans changing the world with their big ideas. I'm your host, Kare Mugo of the Mawazo Institute. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking COVID-19 vaccines. I don't know about you, but I've gotten my jab twice. One AstraZeneca shot, one Pfizer shot. Why two? Because I was vaccinated in two different countries. Kenya when I was home on vacation, and South Africa where I currently live. The result is the same. I'm fully vaxxed and I've had minimal side effects, just a sore arm and a new lease on life. Why did I choose to get vaccinated? Because I want to protect myself, obviously, and also for the vulnerable people around me. I don't want to get anybody sick. I feel like that would absolutely haunt my conscience. And I feel like we all have a responsibility to take care of each other. Anyway, that's my plug for why you should get vaccinated. In this episode, we're going to unpack how the vaccine rollout is going on the African continent. We'll also be talking about what we need to get more Africans vaccinated and what the future of vaccination might look like. I'm going to call in some experts to help us unpack these issues. Stay tuned. Let's start with some facts. According to the latest available data from the World Health Organization's COVID-19 dashboard, there are 47 countries affected by COVID-19 on the African continent. So far, there have been over 5,844,000 cumulative cases reported in Africa since the start of the pandemic, and just over 142,000 deaths reported. These numbers are likely to be higher, but this is what has been confirmed. When it comes to vaccination rates, Africa, a continent of over 1.2 billion people, is carrying out its largest ever immunization drive, and COVID-19 vaccines have now been given out in 52 African countries. This, again, according to the World Health Organization. Africa is facing major challenges in its vaccination rollout, and there are very loud and very important conversations happening around vaccine equity. So far, the continent has only been able to secure a fraction of the vaccines it needs, and only, I say only, 55 million people have been fully vaccinated in Africa. This accounts for less than 4% of Africa's population. By comparison, according to the BBC, the United States has fully vaccinated approximately 54% of its population, and in the United Kingdom, that number is higher, at 65%. To help us understand why Africa is unable to get the vaccines it needs, we invited someone who has been talking and writing about Africa's vaccine rollout since earlier this year. Welcome to the Nairobi Ideas Podcast. Can you please introduce yourself to us?
Hi, my name is Catherine Kyobutungi. I'm the Executive Director of the African Population and Health Research Center, or APHRC, based in Nairobi. I have a medical background and a master's in community health and health management, and a PhD in epidemiology. And I have research interests in how health systems function to be more responsive to Africans. And of recent, I think I would call myself an equity advocate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kyobutungi. You have a very, very impressive background, and you're someone we really wanted to talk to for this episode as we're looking at how the COVID vaccine rollout is going on the continent. Now, in the last year, you've authored some articles in The Conversation Africa and in the New York Times that are discussing Africa's vaccine rollout through the COVAX initiative. Can you briefly explain for myself, our listeners, what or who COVAX is?
So COVAX is a facility which aimed, and I will use aimed in the past tense, to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and to guarantee fair and equitable access for every country in the world. So that is who COVAX is, maybe what COVAX is. Now, who is COVAX? COVAX was established by three, I would say, international multilateral organizations. That is Gavi and WHO, and another entity which is called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And so the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, or CEPI, was set up to mobilize resources for vaccine development. So when COVID came on board, another entity called Access to COVID-19 Tools had been established to ensure that like things to do with treatments and diagnostics and vaccines could rapidly be developed and be launched on the market. And so the vaccine arm of that access to COVID-19 tools is what is known as COVAX. And essentially what COVAX was intended to do was to be sure that they're able to negotiate for vaccines in bulk at a good cost and be sure that their vaccines reach every corner of the world in an equitable manner so that at least every single country can have enough vaccines to vaccinate 20% of their population, largely healthcare workers, but also their population is at high risk, or what they call priority groups.
You state that this was, you use the past tense, it had aims that perhaps it's not realizing at this point in time. And I think the figure for me and maybe some of our listeners that the goal was 20% vaccination across, multiple countries is a new statistic that I'm hearing for the first time. So clearly the goal was not even 100%, but is it even achieving the 20% vaccination or access to vaccines that was intended? What's going on there?
So COVAX aimed to secure and allocate about 2 billion doses of the COVID vaccine by the end of this year. So that was the intended aim. And the assumption was that those 2 billion doses would be largely sent to countries which didn't have their own manufacturing capacity. And the computation was made such that at least for those countries, they will be able to vaccinate 20% of their population. But then the richer countries who had access to other mechanisms, they would also be able to vaccinate 20%. So really the 20% was important, but underlying that 20% was a target to secure and allocate 2 billion doses. So of course, things have not panned out the way they were planned. So far, COVAX has delivered about 240 million, which is about less than 10% of its target. But they've made new projections. And so the new projections show that by the end of this year, they'll have secured about 1.5 billion doses this year. That is a forecast, and the forecast and reality may be different. So they are way off what they are intended to do. And so the chances that they will meet the 20%, total population of every single country vaccinated by the end of this year is unlikely to happen.
Those are some very, very jarring statistics there. And if I can then sort of switch a little bit and talk about how this is playing out in the African region and across African countries, drawing from an article that you wrote in the Conversation Africa, talking about Kenya's vaccine rollout plan. For instance, you mentioned that, the country or the government of Kenya was only able to secure a vaccine supply that would cover 30% of its population. And that was over about a 2-year period of a rollout plan. And you're talking about these shortages that we're already having within COVAX, and WHO's Africa Regional Office recently also noted there was about a shortage of, I think, 470 million vaccines. What do you think are some of the challenges plaguing COVAX and its inability to reach targets that it had proposed itself?
So when you look at the very first Kenya vaccine rollout plan, it largely depended on supplies from COVAX. But then, of course, there was an expectation because this plan was actually going to June 2023. There was an expectation that, over the remaining period of time, then perhaps another 20% of those will be available to cover 30% of the entire population of Kenya. So it was a plan made on the assumption that this is what the global supply chain looks like. And so the plan at that time only covered 30% of the population. But of course, plan keeps on getting adjusted. I don't think that target has changed much because the country expected to vaccinate at least 20% of its population much faster than it has been able to. So that is, one of the realities. So what are the challenges that are plaguing COVAX? One of them is really what I would call the global supply chain. Because vaccine manufacturing is not like manufacturing paracetamol, where almost in every single country or in every region of the world, you can find a factory that can manufacture paracetamol or Panadol as we know it. So vaccines can only be manufactured by a handful of facilities all over the world. And of course, part of it is infrastructure, part of it is control by the vaccine developers or pharmaceutical companies. They don't want to give away their technology so that every single person can manufacture vaccines, and so they lose their competitive advantage. So generally speaking, there are all the factories in the world that have capacity to manufacture vaccines, that are authorized to manufacture vaccines, are operating at like flat out 24/7. But in spite of that, they're not able to produce enough vaccines for the whole world. That is the first problem, that there are just not enough factories that are manufacturing vaccines at the rate at which the world needs them. Now, this has been compounded by the fact that rich countries pre-booked most of the vaccines that are going to be produced in 2021. And there are some estimates which show that up to 70% of all the vaccine production that was intended to happen in 2021, that is possible in 2021, was pre-booked by a handful of countries. Some estimates say 12, some estimates say 14. So just imagine there are almost 200 countries in the world, and 14 of them pre-booked 70% of all the vaccine production in 2021. So what that means is that if you're COVAX, the same countries which signed up to COVAX, the same rich countries which signed up for COVAX, the same ones who in public were supporting COVAX, they still went behind. COVAX is back and pre-booked vaccines by, negotiating now bilateral deals with pharmaceutical companies. So COVAX was a facility waiting for vaccines to buy, but there were just no vaccines on the market for COVAX to buy. As I said, because of the pre-booking. Because what happened was, in those rich countries, every vaccine candidate that was under development, that was still under trial, once it showed promise that it might become a real vaccine, that it might be approved, those countries went ahead and struck deals with the vaccine manufacturers and pre-booked vaccines which are not even yet approved. So COVAX has no vaccines to buy. So that is the first problem. But the supply chain is also influenced by other manufacturing challenges. As I've said, there are very few factories in the world. Some are performing below expected capacity, like the AstraZeneca vaccine. The AstraZeneca itself has had huge challenges meeting up, what it promised, that it would deliver in different countries. There have been very few quality control mishaps that perhaps have taken out about 30 million doses out of the market. And then the US government, at the height of the pandemic, they instituted an export ban on everything that could be used for COVID. And this export ban included ingredients that are used in vaccine manufacturing. So there are factories in the world which are not operating at full capacity because there's a global shortage of ingredients. But really, all these point to global supply chain challenges. Now, of course, the last point is around the global supply chain is politics. The fact that rich countries are looking inwards, they're more concerned about fully vaccinating their populations. They're now talking about boosters, and they are not managing their supplies very well. So they even have excess supplies of vaccines which are never going to be used before they expire. But this is all political. If you are the prime minister of a certain country and you're due for election, you want to control COVID. So the last thing on your mind is COVAX. And so rather than dealing decisively with the pandemic and think about equity, these politics or politicians are more concerned about maintaining systems of power and influence, whether they're internal systems for themselves and their party, or whether they are global systems where pharmaceutical companies, maintain a certain monopoly over the health of the population. So this is something really which has affected the supply chain. Now, I think beyond that, these are sort of external factors. I think maybe another thing plaguing COVAX is maybe a mission crisis, for lack of a better word, given that COVAX was conceptualized, first of all, with very low expectations. It wasn't ambitious enough. And then I think it branded itself as the solution for African countries. There was a time when African countries perhaps thought that, or maybe were told that they cannot have bilateral negotiations with pharmaceutical companies, that every single vaccine coming to Africa will come through COVAX. And now COVAX can deliver. So African countries are now realizing, okay, COVAX was not the only mechanism, and we need to start looking for other mechanisms. So COVAX for now really has been left to coordinate donations from rich countries rather than what it was intended to, that you have these, you're getting directly from manufacturers and you're not waiting for the goodwill of Norway or Denmark or UK, whichever country it is. You're not waiting for that. So now they're left to coordinate donations. That was not the reason why COVAX was set up. So in a way, I think there are conceptual issues from the way it was conceptualized that have come back to haunt it and its ability to deliver on its promises.
We're talking about a crisis in mission. We're talking about, a failure to have good supply chain systems. We're talking about vaccine inequity, which has been a huge conversation that's going on. So, I mean, we're looking at all these different things that need to change. But what are some of the solutions that African countries are right now considering in terms of promoting vaccine access on the continent?
So I think some of the solutions which are needed to promote vaccine access on the continent, I would group them into two. The short and medium term ones are really external looking solutions, and then the long term ones are internal looking solutions. So when I talk about external, this is to try to influence the global supply chain, the politics of vaccine supply, and the politics of global health. Really, those are the short and medium term things that Africa can do. So there's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of advocacy going on for equity. It's coming from the highest levels of the leadership in Africa. But then there's also a lobbying that is global, that of course the African civil society organizations involved in this, but there are also other global players that are involved in lobbying around the waiver of patents and technology transfer that is needed for Africa to start manufacturing its own vaccines. So as I said, the reason why there are few factories manufacturing vaccines is because the pharmaceutical companies are using their own facilities, or they're using facilities of other pharmaceutical industries or manufacturers with whom they've struck bilateral technology transfer deals. So AstraZeneca will strike a deal with the Serum Institute in India, and it is governed by very strict protocols that the Serum Institute of India can only manufacture this vaccine for this period of time, and it cannot use the technology that AstraZeneca has passed over to it for other things. So this is very restrictive because there are many other pharmaceutical companies who do not have vaccine candidates, who have capacity to manufacture in different parts of the world. And so if there were waivers of patents, the intellectual property that now the vaccine developers have, if that was waived, even though temporarily, followed by technology transfer, so that AstraZeneca would now say, okay, we are waiving the patents on our vaccine, and we are willing to support an industry or a factory in Malawi or Senegal or Egypt. We are willing to support that for them to be able to manufacture the vaccine at the standard at which AstraZeneca developed it. So those two have to go together. If that happened, then there would be much more capacity that is redundant right now that could be released. And then now, of course, the number of vaccine doses coming on the market would increase. And within perhaps the end of next year, every single person in the world who needs a vaccine would get it. Advocating for equity, it's a difficult process because it's governed by World Trade Organization rules, and all countries have to sign up to some of these waivers. So it's difficult, but I don't think African countries or African civil society should give up on this. But for me, that's a short, medium-term solution because it solves the problem of now, how fast we can get the COVID vaccine. Long-term, I think Africa needs to invest, like yesterday, in its own capacity for vaccine acquisition. And so vaccine acquisition has different components. Some of it is, yes, it's the production. And you've heard of initiatives where there was a recently launched initiative to increase Africa's self-sufficiency in vaccine production. And it involves setting up 5 regional vaccine manufacturing hubs. And so even money has been resourced for this. Agreements have been signed, I believe, with the hub in South Africa, but also the hub in Rwanda. So this is about manufacturing capacity, but manufacturing is a function of development. So that's a good start, that we want to have our own factories in the world, which are, world class. They have all the quality control procedures and processes. They've sort of mastered the art of vaccine manufacturing, but you cannot manufacture a vaccine which has not been produced. So longer term, Africa needs to invest in R&D infrastructure, research and development infrastructure that will, in the next 5 years, produce and develop Africa's own vaccines. Because if Africa had a vaccine candidate or candidates that it had developed, we would be having a different conversation. It would be more about which pharmaceutical company do we strike a bilateral deal to manufacture the vaccine for us. And because I think in the longer term, if Africa does not develop that capacity for developing its own vaccines, then the next pandemic, and I'm sure there will be many, we're still in the same situation where the rest of the world gets vaccinated and Africa is sitting here waiting and begging for goodwill from other countries.
That is something that Mawazo is really particularly focused on with the work that we do with African women who are in their STEM careers trying to pursue PhDs. And for those listeners who do not know, Africa has a lower average investment in research and development than countries in the West. And so this is an area that really needs a lot of support and really needs a lot of investment. And what you're talking about is a mix of both private and public action and really just coming together, I think, which is the message that the World Health Organization has been talking about from the beginning, that we're not going to overcome this crisis unless we're all in this together and are acting in the best interest of the globe, really. And so if we are to kind of pull out the piece on vaccine equity, because this is an ongoing conversation, and I think it has many entry points. And one point that I'm really interested in, particularly when we are looking at countries on the African continent, how can we approach the question of equity when we're looking at whether African governments are ensuring that broad bases of their citizenry are able to access available vaccines? Is there a rural-urban divide that we also need to be looking at? Are there other areas we need to be talking about vaccine equity outside of just the global north, as it's called, or the global south?
I mean, I think African governments are in between a rock and a hard place. And I think African governments have the best intentions around equity. They had the best plans to make sure that all populations, all geographies have access to the vaccine. But I think African governments may be on their 7th or 9th or 10th plan. They've made plans, they've torn them up, they've made other plans. And these plans have to be constantly adjusted. And these adjustments are based on whether expected supplies do not come in or unexpected supplies come in. It's hard to make a comprehensive plan and stick to it when your supply is driven by drip of donations from rich countries. So in a way, I think equity considerations are there on paper, but in practice, it's very hard. Because just imagine a country like Kenya, which received its first allocation of 1.1 million doses, and they expected and more than 2 million doses within a few weeks after the first delivery. And then nothing happened for about 3 months. So how do you sustain equity in this kind of situation where you don't even know when the next supply is going to come? And now since then, it is 170,000 from Poland, 700,000 from Denmark. Then 2 days later, there's another supply, I don't know from where. Then 800,000 from the US government. Different vaccines, different types of vaccines coming at different times. And if you get, let's say, 800,000 doses of Pfizer from the US government, when you're getting the next allocation, you don't know that. So equity considerations are there in paper on the plan, and governments are trying their hardest to be sure that the vaccine distribution is equitable. And I think maybe the one thing which they've done very well is to define and prioritize the high-risk groups. So almost every single country has defined its priority groups, and they are vaccinating healthcare workers, they're vaccinating teachers. So these are, and then of course, people with comorbidities and people of a certain age. So in a way that is equity, but then the equity consideration with regards to geography, with regards to socio-economic status, I think they have the best intentions, but it's very hard to sustain, that kind of approach where the equity considerations are at the back of your mind when the supply is so erratic.
Just to underscore Dr. Kyobutungi's point around Kenya's vaccination rate, I believe that by July 2021, it hoped to have 1.25 million people with double vaccinations. According to the government of Kenya, September 6th, Ministry of Health statement, there were only 812,000, just over 812,000 Kenyans who had received their double vaccines. And that's a rate of about 2.98% of the adult population has been vaccinated at this point in time. And so, Dr. Kyobutungi, I won't try and keep you long. I just have 2 more questions. When we're discussing COVID-19 on the continent, everything can seem very bleak. The numbers are scary to think of like the huge gaps that are required to get everyone vaccinated and to make sure that people are kept alive and have resources in the hospital. So where are you finding hope?
I think I could say I'm finding hope in the African people. And when I say African people, there are different categories of African people. I'm finding hope in the African, I would say, not political leadership necessarily, but people like the Africa CDC, like the WHO Afro. I think those technical organizations have really been stellar in their response to the COVID-19, whether it is with regards to development of protocols and guidelines and guidance on different things, whether it's with regards to the advocacy for equity, whether it is development of tools, and being Africa's representative and voice in all these global conversations. So that's one category of people that I would say I'm finding hope in. I'm finding hope in African scientists. A lot of countries are relying on homegrown, talent and expertise in driving their COVID response. African scientists have been exceptional in advising their governments and driving the COVID response. But also, I'm also finding hope generally in the Africans, generally speaking. People have been patient. People have been, beaten down by the economic impacts of COVID. Kids are out of school. Parents have lost jobs. There's a lot. People have lost their loved ones. But Africans are still standing and they're still trying. There are people trying all sorts of different ways of going about their lives. And when COVID strikes and the numbers spike, people put on their masks, they stay home, they wash their hands, they sanitize. So there's a lot of hope everywhere. But of course, as you said, the world is bleak. And so the pandemic broke out. The hope was like, wow, within a few months, our lives can go back to normal. The world has other ideas, but we're still hoping, we're still waiting. There are signs that with time, even the uptake and the enthusiasm for the vaccine keeps on increasing. So hopefully by the time the vaccine doses arrive and they're enough, and there's just enough to go around, we won't be also now having to deal with people don't want to be vaccinated. I've not seen Africans demonstrating and saying we don't want masks and we don't want vaccines, all this stuff. It's happening in countries which have too much vaccine around them. So there's hope that it's just the global system needs to be more enabling, and then Africa will triumph over this pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. I think our African scientists have really shown out in the last 21 months. Such brilliance and such commitment and dedication to solving this issue and looking at it from all different angles that is really getting us through it so far. And I also appreciate you pulling out the idea that Africans themselves are also really doing their best to just persevere and make it through. African resilience is a thing that's talked about a lot. And this crisis and this pandemic really exemplifies that in many ways. So my last question to you is, we always end the podcast by asking all of our guests about what their big idea is. So looking ahead, what is your big idea for how Africa can help build its resilience against future crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think ultimately it's something I've talked about, in this podcast. I would want to see African governments. I want to see one African minister, one African president, two African presidents, 30 African presidents, finally waking up to the realization that without research and development, the continent's future is at stake. So really, of course, R&D takes money, and I would want to see this money being African money and not R&D that depends on the goodwill of others from other parts of the world. So for me, I would want to see, research and development being given prominence in national speak, in national priorities, in regional priorities. There are lots of initiatives happening. I would want to see money put where our big mouths are with regards to R&D. At the end of the day, I would want to see an African R&D fund or initiative, something huge and big, where African scientists can finally say, okay, I know that if I start my work on vaccinology or microbiology or whatever it is, that there will be money in Africa that will recognize my value and will invest in me, and that 5 years from now, I can be the scientist that actually produces the solutions that Africa needs. So Africa's resilience really relies on Africa investing yesterday in R&D.
This is a big call to all of the governments and government people listening, and to the rich people also out there. I think we need to refigure how we're investing in the continent. And I agree with you. Being able to support our experts and our talent here is so, so crucial. So thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast, Dr. Kyobutungi. For our listeners, we're going to have links to some of the articles that I mentioned in this episode in our episode notes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Pierre de Vos holds an LLM from the University of Stellenbosch, an LLM from Columbia University in New York, and an LLD from the University of Western Cape. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, I am Pierre de Vos. I'm a professor of constitutional law at the University of Cape Town.
So, on this episode, we've been talking about vaccine rollouts across the continent and some of the challenges that governments are facing in getting vaccines not only into countries, but also into people's arms. And I thought it would be unfair to talk about these structural challenges without a discussion on vaccine hesitancy. So, many people, myself included, would argue that individuals should have the right to make, their own informed decisions on their own healthcare. And on the other hand, there's this argument, the public health argument. And you recently wrote a very fantastic two-part essay on your blog. The blog is called Constitutionally Speaking, and you explore some of the legal issues of this, let's say, a conflict of interest. And the essay does a really good job of, marrying the personal with the legal. And I really want to pick up on, some of the things that you wrote. And I guess my first question to you is, in your opinion, where does self-autonomy or freedom of choice end when it comes to matters of great public health concern like COVID-19?
Yes, so obviously it's very important to try and protect people's autonomy, and especially when it comes to bodily integrity. We know there's a long history of people being experimented on. Sometimes this is also racialized, it has been done in a racialized way. So one shouldn't really limit that right of individuals to choose what medical procedures they want to undergo, whether they want to be vaccinated or not, unless the infringement is so small compared to the broader public health concerns. So there are many examples in democracies that respect human rights, where the so-called greater good was trumped, if you will, a difficult word to use after Donald Trump, but Trump, the individual right. And that is specifically in cases where those who are not, in this case, who are not vaccinated, might pose difficulties or a threat for the larger community, say COVID-19, more rapidly. And in those cases, I think it is possible and it is justified to make the exception and to limit the right to autonomy. But that limitation must be circumscribed in a few ways. There always need to be the option of opting out, in the sense that one should never be physically forced to say, get the vaccine, but to require people to be vaccinated to get on an airplane, to sit in a classroom, to go on public transport is, I think, acceptable. And you have to make another exception, of course, and that is for people's health reasons. If you cannot get vaccinated because of your health, that should be provided for. And the most important thing, there cannot be discrimination because some people don't have access or have less easily have access to vaccines than others. So unless everybody has the possibility of getting vaccinated, any kind of vaccine mandate would, in my view, be quite problematic because it will really further marginalize people who are already marginalized.
You raised some really good points. And in your blog, you brought up polio vaccination as one of the examples that you had about this sort of like negotiation around, public good versus individual autonomy. And I really appreciate that you also are bringing out the idea that we cannot really physically force people and that vaccines have to be accessible and available to people before we can start to ask for people to be vaccinated everywhere or to not be allowed into spaces because they haven't been vaccinated. So if I can take unique case study, which is this position that you were asked to present to the Senate at the University of Cape Town around the legality of a vaccine mandate on the campus. Could you briefly, for our listeners, just summarize what position you ended up landed on?
So the argument there builds on what I've already said, how one balances the different interests, but I made two further points that might be relevant. The first one is that the university is a very unique institution. When one decides these things, one has to look at the specific context. So in the university, the lecturers, students are mingling with one another, often in close quarters. And we know with COVID-19, that really creates more problems, or it is more endangering to people if people have to get involved with one another, be in close proximity to each other, say in a 300-seat lecture theatre. And in that context, I think the university is different, say, from if you do a different job, if you're working for the Department of Forestry and you're working outside, that's a very different thing. So one must be context specific. The second point is one of the reasons why so many people are vaccine hesitant is because they don't have enough information, or they have false information, which is spread on Facebook and Twitter and on WhatsApp groups and so on. And so I pointed out that, at least in the South African context, when our courts have to decide on the infringement of rights and the balancing of different rights or interests, our courts have always accepted the consensus medical scientific view. And I pointed out or referred to a specific case, which in legal circles is quite famous, the Treatment Action Campaign case, where the government at the time said, we cannot give this antiretroviral drug to HIV positive mothers to try and prevent them transmitting the HIV to the baby in their wound and at birth, because the government said this was potentially dangerous to the mother and that it wasn't effective. And then the case went to court, and all the medical evidence, the credible medical evidence, suggested that this was not true. It was safe and it was effective. And the court accepted the medical evidence and said, in this context, we are not going to say that there are two sides to the debate. We cannot decide because the one side says it's dangerous, the other side says it's not. The court accepted the medical evidence. And I think this is the same kind of attitude that our courts in South Africa, at least, will display if they are ever asked to consider these kind of vaccine mandates. And the point why this is important is because the intensity of the infringement of your rights does not really rely on your personal feeling because you are misinformed. Some of the anxiety and why this is such a huge issue for many people is because they don't really trust the medical science. There's generally in democracies across the world, there's distrust in authority and governments for very good reasons. One has to remember that when you balance the interest, you have to understand what you're balancing against each other, and that the infringement here is actually less severe than it might look, because you have to assess this based on the facts, not on fantasy.
So if I can sort of re-summarize what you're saying, your statement was, first of all, there's medical consensus on the fact that these vaccines are safe, they have efficacy, and then balanced with that, or not balanced with that, but tied with that, there is also judicial precedence within South Africa that does allow for the kinds of decisions that the University of Cape Town is considering, correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. So there has actually been cases where the court has gone much further than would be the case if there was a vaccine mandate. For example, when there was a untreatable or a difficult to treat strain of TB, a court actually ordered that the TB patient should be locked up and treated, because if they were let go, they would spread the TB to everyone else and it would endanger everybody's lives. That's quite an extreme case. I wasn't sure that I agreed with the court in that case, but there are many other examples of that kind of decision being made by the courts, coming, especially if it's really dangerous, if it's really threatening to the well-being of the population as a whole, where they come out on the side not of the individual, but on the side of the interest of the broader society.
So if I could ask you, which way did the Senate vote on the mandate for COVID? 19 vaccines?
Yes, so the results were announced today. It was, I can't remember the exact number of votes, but it was about 83% in favor of a vaccine mandate for UCT. This is not a vote about anything happening anywhere else in the country or the world, but the Senate, which is a body that represents sort of the senior academics, 83% of them voted in favor of having a vaccine mandate.
Okay. So we're recording this on September 22nd, and we are apparently making breaking news. So thank you so much. So if I could maybe take this conversation a little bit further. So focusing again on South Africa, which is where you practice, and I mean, which is where you have, developed your knowledge around constitutional law. Is there traction for a national mandate on COVID-19 vaccination? Or can we expect decisions like this to continue to be left to the institutional or perhaps regional level?
There has been discussions in government about the question of a vaccine mandate. At the moment or in the near future, there's not going to be a across-the-board vaccine mandate purely because there's not sufficient access yet and easy enough access to make this palatable either politically or from an ethical perspective. But the government has already issued regulations in terms of the legislation which they use to manage the COVID pandemic, which suggests that individual employers can impose a vaccine mandate if they decide that for specific workers or for the public, this is required. So it is not something that the government is completely against, but it's going to be quite a long time before I think they themselves will make a decision that will say require somebody to be vaccinated to do certain things. What might happen in the next 2 or 3 months, I'm not sure I'm correct, but what might happen is they might amend the regulations dealing with the COVID pandemic and say that specific venues, say a theatre complex or a sports event, will be allowed to have more spectators or a bigger audience if they only allow vaccinated people inside and people who can show a recent COVID negative test. That is something I think that is more realistically possible in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Pierre. Really appreciate having you on the podcast today. And we will continue to watch your blog for more updates related to COVID-19 vaccine mandates and other legal issues. Thank you. So, how are other countries approaching COVID-19 vaccine mandates? Well, we pulled some data from the South Africa COVID-19 online and resource news portal, and here's what they had to say. In Australia, COVID-19 vaccinations have become mandatory for high-risk care workers and employees in quarantine hotels as of June. The UK has plans to make vaccination mandatory for care home workers from October of this year. Proof of full vaccination will also be necessary from the end of September for entry to nightclubs and other venues with large crowds. In July, Canada stated that it was considering whether COVID-19 vaccines should be required for certain roles and positions in the federal government. In Greece, vaccinations were made mandatory for nursing home staff with immediate effect and for healthcare workers from September. Proof of vaccination is also required before customers can enter indoor bars, cinemas, theaters, and other closed spaces. In February, Indonesia made COVID-19 vaccines mandatory. Its capital, Jakarta, also threatened fines equivalent to $357 for refusing the vaccine. In Italy, previously one of the hardest hit countries in Europe, the government approved a decree in March that mandates health workers, including pharmacists, to get vaccinated. In Kazakhstan, the health ministry announced in June that it would introduce mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations or weekly testing for people working in groups of more than 20 people. Poland has announced its intentions of making vaccinations compulsory for some people at high risk from COVID-19. In May, Saudi Arabia stated that all public and private sector workers wishing to attend a workplace would need to be vaccinated. Proof of vaccination would also be required to enter any government, private, or educational establishments and to use public transportation as of August. In Turkmenistan, the healthcare ministry stated in July that COVID-19 vaccination would be mandatory for all residents aged 18 years and older. And in the US, the state of New York has issued a mandate effective from September 6th that requires state employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19 or get tested weekly. And in the state of California, all state employees are required to be vaccinated by October 15th or undergo COVID-19 testing at least once a week. Could a COVID-19 vaccine mandate be coming your way soon? We don't know yet, but we'll be watching to see what happens as more vaccines become available on the continent. To find out more about our guests, find links to information shared in this episode, or to listen again, you can find us permanently on the Nairobi Ideas podcast page at mawazoinstitute.org/podcast. You can also subscribe to the Nairobi Ideas podcast on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Nairobi Ideas podcast is brought to you by the Mawazo Institute, a Nairobi-based research organization focused on female thought leadership and public engagement with research. New episodes drop once a week on Thursdays. Till then, from all of us here at Mawazo Institute, bye and keep it nerdy.